So this other question is probably a lot in my wheelhouse when it comes to persistence inside of Kubernetes. So the question is how to set up a Kubernetes cluster for databases or a scenario where you need to have your data stored. So at least in where I've come from, you still set up your Kubernetes cluster the same way. The best way is high availability. And depending on what you're going to use for a storage backend, I've seen everything from Portworx to Nutanix to having it communicate with your cloud provider to set up whether it's a file or a volume. So there's not really any change that I see. I don't know if you know of anything, Nate, when it comes to changing the way you set up a cluster for persistence.
No, the cluster setup is pretty standard. I will say persistence in your cluster can be a little tricky, so you just have to be aware of the pitfalls there.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if you're running a deployment rather than a stateful set, and you go and update your deployment, you could have some issues getting past those readiness checks with one pod terminating and then trying to mount that persistent volume back into the new pod that's being created. There's just some pitfalls there.
Yeah, absolutely. Another question, which is more on the pipeline side of things, but it says, what are some ways that someone using Argo CD could implement a deploy to stage, test, deploy to prod pipeline besides Jenkins Blue Ocean? I know in our setup, what we do is we just use Circle CI with our Rocket Scripts open source software. So that kind of alleviates the Jenkins portion of that. That seems like that would probably be the most efficient way to do that. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Nate, as far as using Argo in that pipeline.
No, I don't have much experience with Argo, but I will say that CI/CD is very similar in almost all implementations.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to set up your pipelines pretty similar to Jenkins versus GitLab versus Circle. Just have to make sure you set those delineations between your stages.
Absolutely. So this next question, I think, is we could probably talk about for the entire hour. But why Kubernetes? I think I can start with more on the business value side, and then maybe if you want to go on the technical side. From all of the end users that we work with and the customers that we work with, typically the biggest trade-off by using Kubernetes is they're not going to have any vendor lock-in, and I'm going to use heavy hands on this one, but typically it makes it easier. If you can deploy an application to one certified Kubernetes cluster, you're going to be able to deploy that in any cluster. There's some caveats there, but typically 9 times out of 10, the standard cluster vanilla is if your application work there, it's going to be able to work on any other Kubernetes, whether that's in Google, Amazon, or anywhere else. That's the biggest trade-off without kind of going down the rabbit hole of why Kubernetes, because I think our day-to-day this is why you should use Kubernetes. I think sometimes it's a lot easier to say, why not Kubernetes? And that's typically just based around the application cycle. I think Kubernetes makes it easier no matter what you're running because you can change almost everything about it. There's definitely some applications that just don't like Kubernetes. And as far as like the technical pieces to Kubernetes, like coming from development and stuff, what do you see sort of your customers, why are they using Kubernetes versus some other platform?
Yeah, just to expand on that a little bit, Kubernetes a couple years ago, when it was first gaining popularity, it was tough to make that argument for why Kubernetes. I'll say in the last year, the support from all the different various cloud providers and all the tooling that's out there now, the community is huge, and it's easy to get support for things now versus 2016 when you were running Kubernetes. It was like you're kind of left to your own devices and you had to write your own tooling.
Right.
Things have matured in the past couple of years, so it's the reproducibility of running from an application from one cluster to another it's there now. So
right, yeah, that makes sense. And I've noticed that too since about 2016. Everything was sort of, hey, let's just build what we can to get things that we need to do, and now there's just a lot of process and open source out there for us to use already.
Yeah, before I started doing Kubernetes, it was similar. Like it was interesting because I worked at a company that we had data centers up in different parts of the country, and we were trying to keep them hot, and replicate data between the two.
Hmm.
And we had a whole deployment process where we would, roll out like a new version of the application. If that looked good, we would continue our process. It was very Kubernetes-esque, and it was the transition to Kubernetes from what we had was it was very, we had the issues with declaring our manifest and just getting Kubernetes up and running, but the core concepts are it was very similar to what we had built out, as far as like rolling releases and rolling updates. And it's nice to have a common framework to do those things versus having to build something bespoke out yourself.
Absolutely. So I'll go back to this. There's another question, and I think this will answer sort of what one of the attendees has posted, and it's on CI/CD recommendations around Kubernetes as infrastructure. And I think we could try to kind of put a couple of these questions together, because I think that pipeline question drove a lot of other questions. So one of the questions is, we're currently using, and I know you're not super familiar with Argo, and I have minimal experience in it. Um, so we're currently using Argo CD with an app of apps pattern to deploy new applications, and have a cookie cutter repo to build out new Django IDAs with Customize. Do you have a similar way to let devs ship code to prod without needing to learn all of the Kubernetes? So for me, that sounds a lot like how we set up our patterns, whether it's with Rocket scripts. I'm just trying to think.
Yeah, we use, instead of Customize, we use Helm, and we recommend that our clients use Helm for most of their things as well. Um, we do have Rocket scripts, which is solely uses Helm. Um, Without knowing Customize, it's kind of tricky. I would say if you can keep as much of the um, legwork in your pipeline, so that way your developers can just push their code, and the pipeline just kind of takes care of everything. If you're the one maintaining the pipeline and your developers are just shipping their code, you can probably take care of all of that within your pipeline. So they don't need to know Kubernetes, just the basics like get pods or get logs and stuff like that.
Yeah, and typically I think any developer could probably learn that in half of an afternoon, and it just takes muscle repetition to kind of get those kubectl commands down.
Yeah.
So kind of to circle back to another question, it was, do you see many software vendors who create Docker images recommending and or certifying they run on Kubernetes? I would say no. Typically, if it's containerized, it can run in Kubernetes, period. But that doesn't mean that it's built for Kubernetes. A microservice application versus something that's more monolithic, while you could package it in a Docker file, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's great for Kubernetes.
Yeah.
So I think that I've never seen anything that's kind of recommended or certified, but maybe you have, Nate.
I haven't seen anything that's recommended or certified, but most of the big software vendors will have a Docker container. I mean, if their application is able to be containerized, um, and if it's big enough too, you'll probably find a Helm chart in the community charts repo. So digging around there is always a safe bet.
Yeah. So I'm going to go back to this other question, which kind of follows along the lines of um, persistence in the cluster, which I know is kind of a touchy subject in the Kubernetes world. But the question is application database deployments and its workflows. So I, I feel like that question is more or less, what is the workflow to deploy kind of persistence into Kubernetes? And again, I think that it gets very touchy unless your application is built to be, if it can come down and come back up and that storage is sitting outside of your cluster, or you're using a hosted database, or it's sharded inside of Kubernetes, I think you're fine. I don't know of any specific workflows, because again, it seems like it's every application's a little bit different.
Yeah, so we always recommend that you store that persistence in a managed service like RDS or Cloud SQL or something like that. Um, I think the tricky part with workflows, when you do a deployment and say your application has some sort of database migration that needs to be performed, that's always tricky. Um, so you want that migration to execute before your code comes up. You can take care of that in your pipelines. It's just one gotcha that you have to look out for is if you're doing anything with migrations, you have to account for that in your CI/CD workflows.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So this other one kind of goes back to RBAC. So how do you best approach RBAC inside clusters, such as partitioning with namespaces, but also applying roles like operations versus developers versus administrators? How do you define the roles without getting too far in the weeds of choosing individual permissions? So to me, that to break down that question, it sort of sounds like I don't want to have to like go to each user and select everything that they can do. What's the best direction to do this? And one thing that speaks out to me is RBAC Manager, which is in our open source toolkit. And I'm sure you can speak a little bit more about RBAC and how it's set based on the organizations that you work with.
Yeah, this is a tricky one too. I I would probably leverage roles over cluster roles
Hmm.
because I think roles are namespaced.
Hmm.
Um, Depending on where those manifests live, you could include them along with when you're shipping code. Um, yeah, I would do if you're doing anything namespaced, I would do a role over a cluster role.
Yeah, I agree with you. All right, so let's go down this list a little bit. So for your clients that use AWS, do you recommend that they design their system to use spot instances and shift to on-demand when evicted? Are there some service types for which you would always use on-demand instances? I'm going to pass all of that question over to you, Nate.
Yeah, we have a couple clients that really like their spot instances, um, and it gets hard whenever spot becomes unavailable on his own, and like the rug is kind of pulled out from under your application, and all your pods go into a pending state. Um, it's it's tricky. So there's a couple ways you can get around that. You can have multiple node groups out there that use different types of um, spot node types. Um, when that happens, we leverage the autoscaler. So we tell the AWS cluster autoscaler that it's aware of all these different types of autoscaling groups. Um, and most of these we have scaled down to 0. So if you have a spot node pool that's out there, um, it's usually scaled down to 0, and you'll deploy your application typically with a target, like a node label target, and then hopefully that spot instance comes up. Whenever those go away, it's hard to deschedule your workloads and get things shuffled around. So if like spot goes away and then all your workloads get scheduled to on demand, um, it's hard to tell Kubernetes to undo that work. Like you can't proactively. It's not proactive about descheduling your workloads and putting them back on the spot.
Right.
Um, we do recommend a service called Spotinst, which takes care of a lot of that auto scaling for you. Um, it's not something we have implemented in any clusters that my team manages, but it's something to check out because they make that a lot easier.
Absolutely.
I would say service types which you would always use for on-demand instances, depending on your cloud provider, you could have things like that cluster autoscaler that could get scheduled onto a node that's on spot. So a lot of your like cube system critical workloads, um, I think EKS and GKE, um, they'll schedule some of those kube system pods onto the nodes that you're providing. So you should look out for that. If you have something like kubedns, for example, like if that's running on spot and then that node goes away, you need kubedns to be back up right away. So maybe deploy a node pool or an auto scaling group that has a special label that's like critical, and make sure that those never go away.
Right. So another good question. Do you recommend Terraform use to reduce cost and speed development? So here we use Terraform for our infrastructure as code. And I think Nate could probably give me the technical pros to why we use that. Um, so yeah, Nate, did you come from Terraform before Fairwinds and just still used it here as well? I'm just kind of curious your background with Terraform and what do you
Yeah,
see?
I started getting into Terraform a little bit before Kubernetes, and then they just kind of like converged on each other. It they're separate tools. So Terraform itself is really good at um, being declarative about what you want in your infrastructure. Um, it's really nice to Terraform apply something, and then you have 50 servers and like a full VPC and your RDS instances and um, so on. It definitely increases speed, so you're not going in and clicking things in the GUI. I know AWS provides what's it called, CloudFormation,
Hmm.
but that's vendor specific. So Terraform is really cool
Right.
because it has a whole bunch of different providers that are out there, and you can mix and match in one Terraform project. So say if you wanted something that, like we use Datadog, um, and Datadog has a Terraform provider. So we'll use Terraform to stand up a VPC, and then we'll also use that same Terraform project with the Datadog provider to stand up all of our monitors. So it's nice because it's not one specific vendor.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hopefully that answers that.
Yeah, no, I think it does. So another question, which is more regulatory related, but something that I've personally worked on over the last few months is, can a solution be HIPAA compliant if deployed on Kubernetes? And the short answer is yes. Obviously, there's a lot of regulatory relations in there, and the companies that you're working with, whether it's handling private information, etc. And you also have to look at the provider that you're working with. But there's many HIPAA compliant organizations running on Kubernetes currently. So let's see, another question on this list that is what is the benefit of running Kubernetes locally for development purposes? I would say the best part about that is that it's free to run on your local machine, and you can see your changes quickly. Granted, it depends on the application, if you can run the whole stack on your MacBook or Windows or Linux box, whatever it may be. But that's definitely a big benefit for me. I don't know if you have any other benefits for running Kubernetes locally.
Yeah, I use Kind, just Kubernetes and Docker. I use
Hmm.
it almost every day,
Hmm.
testing out Helm charts or testing out something that I'm doing to a cluster before I actually apply it to the cluster. So for my purposes, it's great.
Yeah,
I'm not developing applications and standing them up on Kubernetes,
right.
but I would say it provides the same benefit as running Docker locally,
Hmm.
because you know what you're running inside Docker is what you're getting when you run it somewhere else.
Yeah,
And the same goes for Kubernetes. So if you're organizing your manifests in a way that are reproducible from cluster to cluster, you get that same benefit.
absolutely. Um, and how popular is Helm, and is it needed when planning a product that's delivered and distributed to customers via Docker and Kubernetes? I would say Helm is the most popular. Um, and the other part of that, and is it needed when planning a product? It's certainly not needed, but it makes it a lot easier to deliver that application, um, and to push it out to Docker and Kubernetes. That's the non-technical answer. And Nate, I know that we use Helm every day. So kind of what do you see? I think we already know how popular it is. Maybe the other thing is what is needed when planning a product that's delivered and distributed.
I'm a little bit of a Helm fanboy. It's great. Helm 3 is just came out, and it improves a lot of things. It I would say it is necessary.
Hmm.
If you're not using Helm, then you should be using something else that's templating your manifest for you and keeping track of changes from deployment to deployment. One of the great things about Helm is you create your chart and then you release that chart, and then Helm keeps track of every time that release has changed. So if you're solely deploying with Helm, you can flip back to the third revision or the fourth revision. So say if you have a deployment that goes out, it ran a Helm update or an upgrade on your deployment or your service, and it goes wrong, and you want to roll back quickly. Helm provides a rollback command because it knows it versions what's out there, so it'll roll back to the last iteration that you deployed, so you can quickly get back to a working version. Helm is also really popular with community charts.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a ton of them out there. We use Nginx Ingress off the top of my head, Cert Manager, external DNS. There's just a ton out there. So
Yeah.
if you create a chart for something, you can share that with the world.
Yeah, and it makes it a lot easier to deploy and configure. I know
Yeah.
locally I run Plex and a few other things on Kubernetes, and I have them all deployed with Helm charts, and it just makes my life so much easier than if something goes wrong, I can just go back in a revision. So,
Yeah.
so there's two more quick questions I think that we can get through here. So next generation CI/CD recommendation with Kubernetes as infrastructure. So we use Circle CI and Rocket scripts in our pipeline. That's certainly not the standard. It works the best for us and our customers. And Rocket scripts is on our GitHub page. And then the other question is Kubernetes with AWS and microservices with EKS. So you can put I think this question is more or less seeing the differences between Kubernetes and microservices. Microservices actually run inside of Kubernetes, and Kubernetes can run on AWS compute, or it could run in EKS. You're still going to have that management portion of EKS, which is sort of, this is exactly our bread and butter, and what Nate does every day is manages the configurations and monitors. So EKS does a good job at handling a basic cluster deployment, but there's a lot that goes into it to get to production ready. But you could certainly run regular workloads next to microservices on EKS or AWS compute.
Yeah.
I don't know if you have anything to add to that one.
I would just say Kubernetes, I wouldn't say it's exclusively for microservices. I know like if you go to kubernetes.io, it's like framework for microservices, which is cool, but it's such a flexible tool now. Like you were
Right.
saying, you can run it locally just with a single node cluster and do everything you need to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's all I have to add.
Yeah, I
Kubernetes is
think
really flexible.
that's a good caveat sort of into the beginning of Kubernetes. Like, where do I get started? So another question is, I'm a junior engineer and just started reading about Kubernetes. Where do I start? I think the best place to start for anybody is on the Kubernetes documentation, because they really do a good job at bringing you from kind of level 0 up until you can deploy an application and understand it a lot better.
Yeah, I agree with that. The documentation out there it's really good. If you're just starting with Kubernetes, it also depends on what you're doing with Kubernetes.
Yeah.
So if you're an application developer, you may not care about the whole cluster creation process. If you're like a sys engineer or something, you may care about that stuff. So when I first started learning Kubernetes, I looked at Kelsey Hightower's Kubernetes the Hard Way. I ran through all of that. I actually, as I was running through that, I was writing Terraform to like kind of automate the stuff.
Yeah.
That's a great place to start if you're interested in the ins and outs of like what's running on a node, like what are all the components that makes Kubernetes work. If you don't care about that stuff, I would go straight to the documentation. If you're not familiar with Docker too, I would learn that before you even read about Kubernetes.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. If you
Learn
don't,
how to build a Docker container, how to run it. Then once you're comfortable there, then go to Kubernetes.
yeah, definitely Docker's definitely gonna start on Docker. And I agree with you that. So I started the same way before I got my CK, was kind of did it the hard way through Kelsey Hightower's way, and it was kind of a shock to the system. But then going through the documentation, it made sense. And my background's always been operations, so not so much development, but operations. So that was a good way to go in there. So another question is, how do you respond when someone says that Kubernetes is too complex for their team and applications? So whenever I'm on a call and there you can see that people are getting overwhelmed. There's definitely a learning curve there, but there is with anything that any developers or operations persons do. So the best way to get around that with Kubernetes looking too complex is just take it in chunks. I mean, it all started with bare metal. We got into virtual machines, containers, and Kubernetes is just orchestrating that. And just like anything else throughout history of kind of infrastructure, it's just that. So the learning curve can get a little complex depending on what you're doing, but I think kind of standing up a cluster and understanding how to deploy an application and then troubleshooting kind of falls in place. At least it did for me. And it was very complex when I first looked at it. So I'm kind of curious, Nate, what's your take on that when you first got into Kubernetes?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I've worked with Kubernetes at a couple different places, and I hear that a lot, that it's too complex. Just stand up a server and, and let it go. It's definitely complex if it's the first time you've looked at it. But once you get it in place and you put the processes in place to deploy and monitor, um, I don't think there's any comparison.
Yeah, absolutely. So a question that got asked live was, I'm currently running my application on AWS ECS. What would be your argument for adopting Kubernetes? At what point do you suggest I move to Kubernetes? So that's a very you question. I think if you feel like ECS is getting you're kind of reaching the edges of how it can do it, or you want to manage your cluster better, that's definitely a start. Another thing is if you don't want to be locked in with Amazon and want to be able to move your application, I wouldn't say freely, but more freely, it makes it a lot easier, is to move to Kubernetes. And I think that rings true for any sort of container service.
Yeah, yeah, I agree with both those points. I would also say that if your application's running on ECS and you don't have any problems, don't move.
Yeah,
You know,
exactly.
if you see something on Kubernetes that you can't do on ECS, maybe start evaluating that and making that change. Um, Earlier, I was talking about the community support now for Kubernetes. I would say that's one big pro. Um, with Kubernetes, it's huge, runs on every service provider, runs locally. ECS, you're just running it on Amazon.
Hmm.
So you don't get the benefit of all those Helm charts, the community manifests that are out there. Things that you can automate and do on Kubernetes, you can't do on ECS.
Right. Yeah, or really any of the I think any of the container systems are the same. You're gonna have the same lock in there.
Yeah.
Another question. I am concerned about the massive changes that Kubernetes adoption will bring to my team. How do you deal with culture change? So
That's a
I
trick.
would say that I hear the culture change first, and then uh, Nate and the rest of our team has to deal with the culture change. So one of the big things that I try to facilitate is it's a new technology. There's going to be some technical debt that we're going to weed out, and some technical debt that we're going to add to kind of get you to that level that you're comfortable with it. And that usually comforts people. I wouldn't say that most companies there isn't a massive change. There might be a small swing into what developers are doing and how it gets put into Kubernetes, uh, but most of the work is on the operations side, I feel, and that again, if it's broken apart, the changes can be dealt with, and I don't think it ever gets too overwhelming. And I don't know, you're on the other side of that, Nate.
This is similar. I ran into this too. It's similar to the Kubernetes is too complex for their team or application.
Hmm.
Um, Kubernetes is a big change for an organization. It's I think the best way to introduce it would be make a demo. Um, take what you have, take a small chunk of what you have, stand up something demoable, and show your team. The culture change is hard because you're going to be maybe stepping on people's toes or automation that someone else has created on your team. Um, I think the best way to do it is take what they have
Right.
and kind of massage it to get it to work with Kubernetes. Work with your team, not against them.
Yeah.
Um, it it also doesn't have to be done all at once. So if you have like 1,000 services out there. You don't need to make the cut over to Kubernetes. Like, okay, one day we're just going to be on Kubernetes. We're going to deploy everything and like flip the switch. It can be a gradual thing. So you can deploy service by service by service and slowly get your stack running on Kubernetes. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I agree. So this question, what problems does Kubernetes not solve? And I would say the biggest problem that Kubernetes will not solve is cultural inefficiencies within an organization when it comes to developing. Kubernetes will not resolve that. So Kubernetes will do a lot of things for application and operations and developers, but it will not change how a company operates.
Totally.
Um, if you're,
Yeah.
oops, sorry.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
One of the things I see is a company has a monolithic application and their developers are not so much not wanting to, but afraid of changing to a new infrastructure. And sometimes you'll get one part of an organization, whether it's operations or it's the developers, will appreciate the move, and the other half will maybe that's just, and we just talked about this. Maybe it's not enablement, but for me, it seems like the biggest thing that Kubernetes doesn't solve is that the cultural portion of infrastructure.
Yeah. Yeah. It's to expand on that a little bit. We manage Kubernetes almost purely as code. So we treat updates to Kubernetes as if we're deploying a new application.
Mm-hmm.
It's if you don't have those pipelines and that development process in place, cutting over to Kubernetes will just give you more headaches because it's another abstraction that you have to manage. If you have application issues, say you have a lot of hard-coded things in your application, or it's hard to make configuration changes, Kubernetes isn't going to solve that for you.
Right.
You have to solve that at your application level first,
Mm-hmm.
and then get it onto Kubernetes. You could also get into a state where your Kubernetes cluster gets a little messy. So it's just it could be another junk drawer if you're not taking care of
Right.
what's out there.
Yeah, I that last part rings out because I've seen that going in where companies are already using Kubernetes, and maybe they just kind of let it go and let things run, but they don't realize that there's still processes that have to get done, whether that's regular maintenance or upgrades. So you can get behind really quick, especially with a
Yeah.
3-month release cycle that Kubernetes has.
It's almost like finding that old server in your infrastructure that
Right. Where are these emails coming from that's telling me
hasn't been
there's
touched
something going
in
down? Right.
years.
Um, so some other questions here, and this is more related to kind of how we do things. So one of them is, how do you collect metrics, application and OS from your containers? So
Yeah, so we use Datadog almost exclusively, but Datadog is nice because we can expose Prometheus metrics, and so if your application supports Prometheus metrics, then basically how we do it with Datadog is we set a couple annotations, and then Datadog auto discovers those pods and services and scrapes in the metrics. That's one way to do it. So either Prometheus or Datadog. That's what I have most experience with.
okay, yeah. So another question I got asked is, are you cloud agnostic? How do you look at costs for each provider, pros, cons for cloud agnosticism? So I would say we don't like to use the word cloud agnostic. It's definitely, we try to reduce vendor lock-in. Kubernetes is very much built around the idea of cloud providers. So when you build one infrastructure as code for one cloud provider, it's not easy just to bring it up and move it. It does make it a lot easier when you're not on like a managed Kubernetes. And then how do you look at costs for each provider? So we have an open source tool called Goldilocks, which is part of that. Another thing is just kind of comparing whether it's using a vertical pod autoscaler, which is in Goldilocks, to kind of see where we're going. And we have that open source, but we also have some closed source software that we use called Insights that does that same thing, which kind of gives you day 2 and 3 and beyond sort of view into the cluster, which is pretty cool. Which I don't think I've seen that anywhere else as far as the tools that come with it.
Yeah, I would say cloud agnostic is, I mean, how often are you going to change cloud providers really? Like once you once a business is committed and they have their application running somewhere,
Right.
if it's not a huge cost or a huge benefit to move clouds, you're probably not going to. I will say we do support all of the major cloud providers now, and we do that with Terraform.
Yeah.
Kind of to go back up to that Terraform question. Terraform, the way different providers are laid out, it's not easy just to say, okay, I'm going to change my provider to AWS and execute my Terraform again.
Right.
Yeah,
Or from Azure to, it's vastly different how the tooling's named and everything else. Yeah.
exactly. Yeah.
So another question, how do you handle non-prod clusters in environments? So I'm going to take this question as how do we handle it here at Fairwinds, a non-prod cluster and environment?
Yeah. So we, for most of our engagements, we'll build out 2 clusters, a production cluster and something that we call a working cluster or a staging cluster. Um, so if what I was saying earlier with testing out changes, so I'll also run a kind cluster locally,
Hmm.
deploy things there. We handle our non-prod customers clusters the same way we
Customers.
handle our prod cluster. So
Right.
it's it's in the same vein as deploying your application to a staging environment and then deploying it to prod after you do testing.
And I think that that's very important to let everybody know that your dev environment or non-prod should still mimic and replicate exactly what your prod's doing,
Definitely.
because you'll not be able to figure out what's going on between one or the other. And I think a lot of times the non-prod clusters may get put in the back burner, but it's really important that those stay the same. So I always found that interesting here that it's managed the same way to make sure that there's consistencies between the two different working environments.
Yeah.
So another good question is, my company was just featured on Good Day America. How do you handle scaling events? Do your clients have auto scaling, and what metrics are you looking for to trigger auto scaling? So the first portion of that, yeah, there's auto scaling would be built out based on applications. We definitely have customers that have had this happen, or maybe not Good Day America, but have had this happen where they've had a big PR event, or when it's around a shopping day, a big shopping event. So what are some of the metrics that you built out for customers that help trigger that auto scaling event?
Yeah, so there's 2 ways to scale a Kubernetes cluster and the things inside of it. Um, the first way I'll talk about is something called the horizontal pod autoscaler, or HPA.
Hmm.
Um, that is something that will scale out the pods inside of your cluster. So say you have a web app that starts getting a lot of traffic, you can configure your HPA. HPA v1 you can configure either to scale based off of CPU or memory usage.
Hmm.
A better way to do it would be use the HPA v2, which would scale off custom metrics. So kind of going off the metrics question earlier, if you have a metric that's exposed basically like requests per second or queue depth,
Right.
you could scale off of that preemptively and your cluster will grow. But it'll only grow to the size of your auto scaling group. So it's important to also scale your Kubernetes cluster nodes. So your HPA can only go up to a certain limit where it can only fit so many pods. And then your cluster has to start scaling and bringing in more nodes. And that's what we use the autoscaler for.
Okay. So another good question here, which I think is a follow-up to what you said. So how do you monitor your Kubernetes environment? So again, we use Datadog, and kind of what Nate just went over. We use the different metrics and annotations to look inside of the cluster. That's how we manage that and monitor it. Um, Another good question is here, are in your cluster upgrade change process, do you have a standard testing framework to validate that the changes you make produce a reliable, healthy Kubernetes cluster? If so, what components are most important to test? So I've done an upgrade here with an engineer. It was very thorough, and there's a lot of moving parts. So Nate, maybe you can speak sort of on that. What is the most important parts? To me, it's the core components, and then obviously making sure the application's running. But what are some things that you see when you've done upgrades and the process that you follow, and how is it tested before we roll that out to our end users?
Yeah, it's different per cloud provider. So we run on AWS, GK or GCP, and Azure, and it's different between all three. So on AWS, we have some EKS clients and then some COPS customers.
Hmm.
So it's kind of different between the different versions. Standard testing between them. We leverage Terraform a lot, so if Terraform doesn't upgrade, then we'll know.
Right.
Um, we also have tooling that will automatically stand up clusters at a certain version, so we can know, say, if our tooling isn't compatible with Kubernetes 118 or 117, we'll know that ahead of time before we even try to attempt an upgrade.
Right. So this kind of follows on with that one. Another question about our tooling. Are you rolling your own clusters with a tool set like Kops or Kubespray, et cetera, or are you using a managed service like EKS, GKAKS? What decisions led to your ultimate choice? So for the first part of that, I can answer that. We use Kops with Terraform, and then you can do this on top of one of the managed Kubernetes services or on any of the compute. So I guess my question for you, Nate, and this may be a little bit open-ended, but what decisions led to us for using those toolings?
A lot of those decisions are led by the client.
Mm-hmm.
So, say a customer wants to run on, say they're already on GCP, the obvious choice would just be go with GKE.
Mm-hmm.
If they're already on AWS, it's a little bit trickier. Um, the managed service providers, they abstract the control plane from you, so you don't have to worry about maintaining your master nodes like etcd, the Kube API, and everything like that, which is really nice. But it also takes some of that it takes some of that away from you, and you're not able to configure some of the advanced features that Kubernetes can provide. So say
Right.
you add some additional flags to your API server, or you need to configure your kubelet in such a way that the best example I can think of is cron jobs were like an alpha feature years ago.
Right.
And on the service providers, the alpha features were not enabled, so I actually had to manually turn that um, on a cluster that I managed. Um, with Kops, you can do that. With EKS, you can't. So it's just something to be aware of.
Yeah.
There's always a trade-off there, and EKS is a couple versions behind. So say there's a feature in 117 that you want, your service provider might not be fully there yet. They might not support that version.
Okay. So another question that got asked, are you using Kubernetes secrets or something stronger? What do you use to manage your secrets?
Um, the secrets that we manage, I mean, eventually they get turned into Kubernetes secrets. But before they get turned into Kubernetes secrets, our internal tooling takes care of a lot of that for us. So we'll store our secrets in Vault or 1Password, and we'll pull those things in, and then run our Helm updates, and they only exist in the session that we're in. Um, we we use rocket scripts for some of our clients, and in that case what we do is we use Mozilla SOPs, and we'll encrypt a secret or like a YAML file. We'll encrypt the YAML file, and then once it's encrypted you can commit it to Git, and then in the CI process there's a step that'll decrypt that file for you using your key manager. So like AWS, it's KMS.
Yeah,
Um,
P
each
something. I was trying to
yeah,
remember what it started with.
each provider has a different one. So
Right.
we'll typically use that to decrypt that secret and then apply it. But in Git, it's always encrypted. So
Yeah.
that's how we
Okay.
typically manage it.
So this kind of ties together all of these tooling questions. It says, what are your go-to tools for Kubernetes? So I think we've gone a lot over the tools for the infrastructure portion. So I guess maybe what are some tools you use when you're managing a cluster, like on your local machine, or if you have to go to a box or something?
Yeah. So Helm is definitely one of them. Um, Stern is a
Hmm.
good log viewer. Um, Stern. That's a cool one. I use that all the time because say you have a deployment that has like 10 replicas, rather than typing out kube control logs, like over and over
Right.
and over to get all of those, you can just type Stern and it'll auto match and pull in all the logs for a specific thing.
Nice.
So that's a great tool. I use that all the time. Um, Another one would be Kind, since
Yeah.
that'll create a small Kubernetes cluster on your local machine. Um, those are the two big ones that I use that are Kubernetes specific. I'm sure there's more.
Yeah. I think, what is it? Cube CTX that changes
Yeah, yeah,
context.
kubectx. That'll change your context, and it'll also included in that is kubeNS, and that'll stick your context to a specific namespace. So
Okay.
you don't have to constantly type out kubectl-in and then your namespace. You could just use kubeNS, say like staging, and it'll like auto stick your context to staging, and so then you can just execute kube control commands.
Okay. Yeah. And I think other than Stern, I used most of those tools when I was in more of an engineering role. Um, so I'm just looking at this last little bit here of questions.
One one more
Oops,
real
sorry.
quick on that.
Yeah.
We have a metrics tool that we use called resource or kube capacity.
Okay.
So it's like a kube control plugin, and it gives you more than just like kubectl top. It'll let you view the actual resource usage in your cluster. Um, that's that's the other tool that I use all the time. Just figure out like, oh, a node's overwhelmed. Like how can I tell? Like what workloads are on there and how much resources are they using?
Right.
Uh, Kube resource capacity.
So another, let's just see here. Um, so we have about 7 minutes left, and I have a few more questions here. What are the processes running in a node in Kubernetes? So that would depend on worker or master. You're always going to have the API server, scheduler, um, controller manager on a master, and then you always have kubelet, kube proxy.
Mm-hmm.
Um, there's other ones like Docker, whatever could be on the node as well. I'm probably missing a few there, Nate, but it's also been a few weeks since I've been inside the process side of Kubernetes.
Yeah, it depends on the type of node. So I think you covered them all.
Yeah,
Some clusters, etcd will run on the masters. That's the only other one I could think of.
yeah. What SLAs do you strive for? So we're heavily based on the cloud providers. We personally will have a response time of 15 minutes for any sort of incident. Um, how do you handle storage shared among containers? So again, persistent storage, this could be relative. Every pod with containers shares the same file system volume, or they can. Anything outside of that wouldn't. And then persistent storage, again, that's a very broad question because there's many different providers. What cloud services are you leveraging? Honestly, it's whatever the application needs for the customer. Um, and let's see here. How do you update the resource limit requests for a pod without restarting the pod? So ideally, you should be able to restart your pod whenever and have no problems with your application.
Yeah,
Um,
there's no way to do that without restarting the pod.
right. So as long as your application is built to be ephemeral and you can update those resource limits, you can have different rollout strategies when you do those changes so that you don't lose anything or end user doesn't see any downtime. I think this is a good question. When building out your infrastructure with Kubernetes in mind, were you at all concerned about the security of your API server? Yes. And then the second part of this is, do you expose your API server to the internet, or is it only accessible via something like a VPN?
Yeah, I think best practice is to put your API server on a private network, so that way it's not exposed. So
Hmm.
when CVEs come out, you're not just out there for you're not just out there as a target.
Right.
If you are exposed on the internet, you should lock down what source IPs can hit or your API server based on a whitelist.
Right.
Um, yeah, yeah.
Okay.
The ones that we do have private, we do connect with a VPN.
Okay. So we have a few minutes left. Is there anyone that has any other live questions that they would like answered? You can use the Q&A feature in Zoom, but as far as the list of questions we go, I think we got through about 99% of them. I think there was just a couple here that are a little offshoot, but is there any other questions that we can answer for you?
While people are putting together questions, I'll just quickly say the two most important things that I think all workloads should have when you run Kubernetes would be
Hmm.
resource limits and lifecycle shutdown, like a graceful shutdown.
Right.
Those are the two gotchas. So if you don't have resource limits, a single pod can take down a whole node, which could take down all the services on that node. And if your application doesn't shut down gracefully, you're going to have downtime. Kubernetes won't solve that for you.
Right. So one question that got asked is, Brandon, how does your role differ from SRE? The SREs do all the work. No, I'm in the pre-sales cycle. I was an SRE for about 10 years, and I'm more on the point of concept side and sort of finding our fit here at Fairwinds for a customer. Is Kubernetes a good choice to run a Spark cluster? I'm not super sure I know if that's an acronym or software. Maybe you do, Nate?
Yeah. As long as you know what you're doing with Spark and persistent storage, then I would say it would work great. You just have to be careful with that persistence.
Absolutely. I've seen Spark a million times, and every time I Google it, I'm like, oh, that's right. It's the big data stuff from Apache.
Yeah. Yeah, there's ways to run persistent workloads on Kubernetes. You just have to be careful.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we can get this last question in. What is the workflow for deploying applications in Kubernetes? Please explain role of service, build, and deployment. And yes, there will be, I believe there will be a recording available after as well. So that part of the question for you, Nate, is please explain role of service, build, and deployment.
Workflow. So most of that's going to be in your CI/CD. Most pipelines that I've created have a build step or a test step, really, to test like what
Mm-hmm.
your code is doing and if it's even valid to be built into a container. So run through a test, build the container, maybe run a test again to make sure inside your app, inside the container works properly. Deploy it to a staging environment. And then you could either automate this if you have a really good QA team, or do manual QA testing on that staging environment. And if everything's good there, push it to prod.
Absolutely. Well, we're at the end of the time here, but I appreciate all the questions that we had. And I hope that we answered everybody's question. Nate and myself are available on LinkedIn if there's any follow-up questions, certainly. And this recording will be available, and I'm sure David will get that off to everybody. But again, I appreciate everybody's time for kind of sitting around and listening to us chat. And if you have any other questions, again, reach out to us.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks everyone.
See you later.